Welcome to the Global Marketing Show, where we explore how language and culture impact global business. I'm Wendy Pease, your host and president of Rapport International. Let's get started. Welcome back to another episode of the Global Marketing Show. And as you know, the podcast is brought to you by Rapport International, who connects you to anyone, anywhere in the world across 200 different languages. And today's tidbit is about a weird law in France. And you're not allowed to stare because it's against the law to stare at the mayor of Paris. So if you happen to be in France and you're standing by Notre Dame and the mayor of Paris comes by, don't stare at him. So, with that, I would like to introduce you to today's guest. Dr. Sarita Jackson is founder and CEO of the Global Research Institute of International Trade, and she's significantly impacted the business landscape in 2025 by assisting over 30 U.S.-based companies in expanding their international sales to new markets. Her expertise has proven invaluable in terms of guiding these companies to thrive despite the uncertainty caused by rapid changes in the U.S. tariff policies. Sarita, welcome.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, I am so thrilled to hear about the story. So, since the tidbit was about France, have you ever been to Paris and seen the mayor of Paris?
Well, unfortunately, I have not been to Paris yet.
Yeah.
But maybe when I get there, I will try to meet the mayor, and I know what not to do.
It's funny sometimes the laws you can find and not even be aware of. So you've individually helped 30 companies this year with these crazy tariff laws. So tell me a good story about an experience that you've had.
Yes. So let's say for me, the date that's stuck in my head is the April 2nd announcement of the reciprocal tariffs. That was Liberation Day. And what was so interesting about that for the 30 companies there were more companies, but it's this cohort that's so important to me. Of the 30 companies was getting the call from one of the companies that was already exporting, because many of them are exporting out. So the tariffs will impact you when you're importing, right? Because it's the tariffs on any goods that are coming into the United States. And I can talk about that. But what was interesting about that date was a company that was exporting, they manufacture in the United States. So they weren't directly hit by our tariffs, but the concern was, oh my goodness, what does that mean if we're exporting to a country such as Canada? Are there going to be retaliatory tariffs? What do I need to know? And so with that, that kind of started everything that I had to deal with this year with exporting companies. These are small businesses now, multi-million dollar businesses, but small nonetheless, where their concern was, okay, what do we need to be aware of, or how do we prepare when we are identifying new markets or trying to grow in existing international markets with regards to any retaliation on the part of different countries? So in that case, I was able to calm her down and say, for now, we're okay. The tariffs took effect later on this year, but I said, well, in that, so far, you're not dealing with any kind of steel or aluminum. You're not importing. You're exporting out. And with your particular product, you should be okay with continuing to export to Canada. And as long as it's USMCA compliant, meaning that it's produced here in the United States, Canada, or Mexico, you should be okay. So that was kind of the start of everything, starting with that company, the call, oh my goodness, what do we do? And then now trying to work with a number of companies on identifying new markets, understanding the policies in those countries, if there are retaliatory tariffs or if there are trade deals.
Wait. So hang on a second. I want to go back to this individual company. So sorry to interrupt, but I'm so curious. You said in her industry, can you share her industry or product or something? Keep it general if you'd like.
Yeah.
And then would there be a difference with different kinds of products
Yeah.
and how that would affect?
Yeah, great question. So just broadly, we will just say in the med tech space. And so absolutely, it does depend on the product. And that's where I had to work with different companies because the companies were a wide range, coming from a wide range of industries and different types of products. So that's where for Grit, what we do here is that customized market research that when I'm helping companies, I have to understand the product, their product line. And when I say line in terms of international trade, how it is categorized in what's called a harmonized code, how it would be categorized in that regard. And then once I understand the product, the end use, etc., then that's where we can say, okay, well, for when we look at, in this case, Canada, what their, according to their customs and according to how your product is classified, whether or not there will be tariffs placed on that product. It should not be just generally speaking, because we have a trade agreement with Canada, right? As long as, again, it's USMCA compliant. Each product, each company that has a different product requires different sources of information to see, okay, well, do you need to worry about export compliance regulations? Or is it just a product where there are zero duties? Or is it something where, because this year has been so unique, where there are specific tariffs that are placed on specific products?
Oh my God, my head is spinning. I mean, I knew it was complex and I'm glad you're figuring this out. So, what types of products might not have to worry about tariffs? What types of products really need to be concerned about tariffs? And then what kind of falls in the middle, which might really depend?
Fortunately, for many of the companies, they did not, and we're just talking about those companies where they were exporting to countries where we've had a trade agreement. So Canada and Mexico under the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, or if there are other countries where we have a trade agreement. As long as that company's products align with the rules within those trade agreements, then they could still benefit from the trade agreement. So with Canada, as I mentioned earlier, USMCA compliant, as long as your production is here in the United States, in the case of this company, then you should not have to pay tariffs. Now, there are other taxes, there are other types of taxes to worry about, but if we just stick with tariffs, then you should be able to export your product, sell your product in that market, or access that market, I should say, duty free. So that's one.
So if I have if I develop a medical product in the US and I want to export it to Canada and I've manufactured it here, tariffs aren't going to be an issue. Whereas if I manufacture it in Asia, anywhere, and bring it into the US or want to take it straight into Canada, even as a US product, I could hit serious tariffs.
Exactly. So that gets to your next part about which companies have to worry about the tariffs. It's those companies when they're importing in, let's say, from an Asian country, let's say China, because some of my companies have gotten hit by China. But let's say if you're importing your inputs, whatever is needed to create that final product, well, quite naturally, you're going to, number one, be hit by the tariffs coming into the US market. But you cannot import into US, Mexico, or Canada and then say, oh, I'm going to take those inputs for my manufactured product and then try to take advantage of the USMCA. That's not allowed. And that's the challenge where I've had companies, well, can I bring in the goods, have it in Mexico, do the assembly, the final assembly in Mexico? No, because the inputs still come from a non-USMCA country.
Wow. Wow. So that's a ton to track.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So how you get your business, what stage they're usually in, and then how you specifically help them.
Great. Okay, so how do I get the business? Well, I will say a lot of it comes from giving workshops or training sessions in person, and then now a lot more virtual. But that would be how people would get to know what I do and the value to their company. The reason being is, and I tell people, I was just talking to a good friend yesterday and saying how when I started my company in 2013, and I'm talking about tariff policies and another thing, non-tariff policies and trade agreements, it was just like, yeah, that's nice. Because I'm in Los Angeles, so the question would be, well, do you move goods? Like, am I affiliated with the ports or am I in logistics? And the answer was no. But I'm talking about policy. So the only policy and research, and then research means different things to different people. So the only way that I could really show the value to companies would be giving these types of training sessions, learning about the companies, and then of course as they started to get hit with tariffs, not just under this administration but previous administrations, when they started to feel the effect. And then I would say, well, these are your options or your opportunities with understanding the policies. And when I say policies, I'm talking about trade agreements, trade programs. That's where people started to understand. And so that's how I get people. Now, in terms of how I help them, then that's where it becomes that customized market research, that it's in-depth research that applies specific for that company. I am not a generalist. I tell people you can Google the what and the how. You can Google that. You don't need me for that. Why are we doing what we're doing? And when I say why, it means let's do the research to find out what market makes sense for you, or if you're importing, how you can leverage bringing your goods into the United States and succeed, or if you're an overseas company that wants to come to the United States, so you're exporting from another country to the US, why does the US market make sense for you? Or for US companies, why does, Mexico, I don't know, Botswana, whatever country we come up with, make sense for you? Then we do an in-depth analysis to show them why. And the reason why companies really have valued that, getting that level of detail, because, sometimes people will say, oh, I know someone in that market. That's great. But that doesn't mean it's really no business. Just because you know someone, good luck with that. So we go into all of the details about that particular market that makes sense for your company. So it's like telling a story. What story makes sense for me? Not just, oh, go to this market or some general stuff. What makes sense for me? Then we do the third part is develop a strategy and connect a company with the right resources on the ground so that they can be successful and not just, oh, I exported to this market, one and done, but I'm doing so competitively over the long term.
Have there been clients that you've worked with that have thought they'd go into one market, and then when you've done the analysis, you've recommended other markets, and so they had to pivot to, and then they did pivot to that?
Absolutely. Great question. And you use the keyword pivot. That is one of the things where, yeah, companies will come to me again because someone told them, and I'll say, well, what was the basis for that? And there are all kinds of reasons. But then I will say, okay, you can consider that market if you want, but here is the data to show why these top, let's say 3 to 5 markets would make more sense for you. And I did have I had two companies. I had two companies actually where one of the companies I was working with the business owner, the other company was a sales manager. And when I provided them with that data and we go through it, so I don't just say, here's a report and
Can
good
you
luck.
can you give us a little more detail, like what industry, what market, and where they went?
Yeah,
Is
one was
that
in One was in med tech. I had quite a bit of med tech
Okay.
this year. One was in med tech, and then the other one was in building and safety.
Okay.
Yeah, very broadly speaking. And when I think for both of those were Canada. Canada was a market. And, they'll say, hey, well, I'm looking at these markets or I'm looking at that market. But one of the things was when I went through the data, one of the comments was, oh, I need to tell my boss, we need to go in this direction. We've been sleeping on this particular market, even though you're hearing all the challenges, whatever, in the news about US, Canada, but still, trade is still happening, right? And
Right.
if they have a unique product, they can still consider that market. So those were the two cases. Another case where with the building safety company, they had just received interest from Canada. They had just received interest, and then when I showed them this is a market, they said, "Oh, well, this really makes sense. We've gotten interest, so now we can really invest our resources and look at this market, and then how to manage beyond this one a company that was interested in their product."
Okay, so that's interesting because Canada is the number one trade partner within the United States. It's very easy to go into. It's the geographic language. There's a lot of criteria. So, it seems less intimidating, but financially, so what were some of the criteria you looked at and what were some of the other markets that you recommended?
hmm So for the criteria, just starting really with the trade trends for that product. So we look at, I mentioned earlier, the product line, but when I say product line in terms of how it's categorized in international trade, that harmonized system. So we started off looking at, well, what are we seeing with the trends to with regards to identifying the top, in these cases, I just did the top 5 markets. Let's look at that. And then it went into the main piece of that compared to other markets was that we have this USMCA agreement. It makes sense. As you pointed out, it's right here. We have an agreement that gives you preferential access to that market. And where you see that there is a consumer, there's a demand for that market. Some other criteria that I looked at when we got into the market analysis was looking at the industry overall and what are we seeing with regards to companies in that space, the revenue generation over a long period of time, consumers, what are the values, what's important to them when they
Mm.
are purchasing products. Are they how are they purchasing these products, right? Or how are they buying? What's their purchasing habits? Are they using e-commerce? All of those types of things went into that. Now, I don't remember the specific other markets for each of those because like I said, it's 5. But what I can say is for some other companies that were part of this cohort, there would be some European markets to consider for their exports. And yeah, and I'm thinking about one company that was in the cosmetic space that had gotten hit really bad with tariffs going to Europe. And
Ah.
and so then when I was able to identify a European country, even though it all falls under the European Union regulations, but I was able to show that company this is a European market you can consider. And this is what we see with regard to your type of cosmetic product, your specific product, and the demand and the purchasing power, so on and so forth, in that particular market. And he was very when we got done, he just said, "I this is so much more than what I expected. I had my goal set on Europe, but not the right European country." And so then when I talked about that country and showed him why this country makes sense, and then how he can develop a strategy so he doesn't get hit by all of these tariffs. Yeah, it was let's just say
That
very.
is fascinating to me. I hadn't realized that before, that if the laws govern Europe, but the tariff issues and the market entry can be that different among the different countries there. Taking the time and pick which country you enter in Europe really makes a difference.
Exactly. And this is why being very specific is important. That's why I stress I am not a generalist. I don't just say, oh, all cosmetics goes into this market. It's really taking that time to understand the company's resources to begin with. And I think, oh, your second question when you were asking me kind of about the size of the companies or the types of companies. And so
Yeah.
many of them are small companies. Yeah, and where are they in the process? These are smaller companies, but they're $1 million and up, right? They're $1 million and up, and they are already exporting. That's what makes it so good. They're already exporting to different countries around the world, not just one country. Many of them are exporting some of them when they've come to me, it's, hey, I'm in this market like Canada or even Mexico. I just finished with someone with Mexico where it's like, yeah, we've exported once, but we're not doing as well as we would like. And Mexico made sense for that product. And there another one, vehicle safety, one that was in the emergence, kind of the natural disaster space. So Mexico made sense for those two companies, but they were saying, well, we're not quite sure how to access those markets or do better, do better. I mean, we're already there, but how do we really leverage? And this is where being very specific, understanding your resources, understanding your specific product, not just the general industry. I mean, we start there, but we bring it down to your specific product. And then the analysis is all aligned around your particular product and your company's resources so that you can export over the long term and not get frustrated. Because I've heard this where one company came to me and somebody had mentioned a market for them. It looked good. I guess however they came up with this, I don't know. They looked something up and it
Yeah.
looked good. But then when the person started to that market, she was so frustrated. She says, "Yeah, I'm trying to use the e-commerce. It's all of these other things that challenges and barriers that I'm facing for that market, and I'm just getting frustrated." And that's one of the things I try to avoid by going deep into the product, the resources, and then really understanding the market, especially when it comes to regulations and things of that nature. I present a holistic view. Your market, the market you're coming in with might not
Okay.
make sense.
Yeah.
This makes sense, but this is what you need to know. This is why this market makes sense for you. At the same time, these are some challenges that you need to be aware of to invest your resources to address some of those challenges.
Okay. And that really, it's getting down. I mean, in marketing, they always say focus on your niche, and do
Yeah.
really well on that. And you're bringing people down into that. Can you give us an example of a company that, like the one you started was, or you mentioned that you work with many small companies of about 1 million. Do you do the research and then then they go to next step and implement it? Or are you working through and can you tell us about some of this success? Like they grew 50% or their revenues went from, 1 million in that company to 2 million with the benefit of your research?
Right. So once the research is done, then that last phase of the strategy, I devise a strategy for them and then connect them with the resources that can help them with the actual implementation. Now, one of the things, especially with the companies from this year, do keep in touch with them to see how they're progressing, how they've benefited or the benefit for their company. Quite right now, we are still waiting to see what the numbers are in terms of the generating the revenue. But
Yeah.
when we look at how much they save, that's very, very important to minimize their risks and save money on whatever the tariff rate could be. I don't have that dollar value for each of them in my head, but
Yeah.
whatever the potential tariff could be, that's a saving for that particular when their product is either going into that market or if they're importing, because as I mentioned at the top of the interview, I said that many of the people for the US tariffs are hit because they have to pay those tariffs bringing goods inputs into the United States. If we have an agreement, and this is some of the work I've done as well. Why not consider markets? Now I understand there are a lot of unique things for, whatever that input is, but if it's something that can be manufactured in different parts of the world at the same quality, why not consider importing, let's say Mexico, for example? And I do have a client, yeah, and I need to follow up with him, but he did shift to Mexico for what he needed to manufacture. Well, that saved him on all the tariffs that he was going to have to pay importing from China. Why not go to Mexico?
Ah.
It's right here, it's close. And then when you import that particular product, you don't have to pay the duties. Now, if a product, I do want to clarify, if it has steel, aluminum, or or it's under one of these unique tariff situations where there are tariffs, well, you can't avoid it. But if it's a product that will be USMCA compliant, doesn't have steel or aluminum, for example, then you can bring that in duty free. So it's more so on the savings when it comes to the duties and the regulations when it comes to, for example, the building safety company, where they found value in letting them know about export compliance regulations so they do not get hit with any kind of serious fines when exporting, in that one, that was Canada, so that they do not have any challenges when exporting to Canada.
Well, I have one last question on tariffs, and then I wanted to get into some of the non-tariff barriers and stuff about the technology and digital trade. But on the tariffs, what's the worst situation you've seen a company in and having to pay tariffs?
Yeah, this one I was thinking about, or the whole time I was talking. Let's just say they were kind of in the sports industry, very broadly speaking, sports
Yeah.
industry. And when I worked with that company, it was we really tried, but they were getting hit by the tariffs. But it wasn't only the tariffs; there were some other things where they just weren't generating the revenue, so on and so forth. And let's just say the last time I brought in a team, but the last time that I spoke with that company, it was basically, and the guy mentioned it from the very beginning. He says, "I don't think we are going to make it through 2025."
Oh.
Yeah, that's the one that breaks my heart.
Was that because the tariff? Oh, I see. You were saying because it was high tariffs, but then it was also struggles with
Some
revenue
other,
and everything. Oh, that's
yeah,
heartbreaking. And tariffs really were that much of an effect on the business?
yeah, it did, because you have some companies where pretty much everything is coming from China. And when they're looking to say, okay, because of the policy focusing on manufacturing here in the United States, they said, well, maybe we could try to find some suppliers here in the United States. The prices just were just too much. And so the last conversation, I pretty much got it. I brought in a team. I said, let's really figure this out. But a lot of the different options still would require a significant amount of investment. So if you're not generating the revenue, you're getting hit with the tariffs and some of these other things that had already impacted the company prior to the tariffs. The tariffs just exacerbated the problem. Then
Ugh.
it just pretty much, I kind of, I guess the company just said, we're just going to have to just pause or try to focus on some other things, but for now, just not keep going.
Yeah. Oh, that's heartbreaking. Absolutely heartbreaking. All right. We don't have much time, but I do have some rapid fire questions I want to ask you. What are some of the non-tariff barriers that you see people run into?
Yeah, so when we refer to non-tariff barriers, that refers to the regulations. The company that I mentioned that was that appreciated the information about export compliance. That's an example of some the regulations. And let me just clarify, when I talk about compliance for the US, that means making sure that your product is not cannot be classified as dual use, meaning that it can be a product that you may have one use for it, and then it can be used for military purposes or something
Ah,
like that. That's what I mean. But when I talk about non-tariff barriers generally, not just the United States, just internationally, it can be anything from intellectual property laws, um, standards, sanitary, phytosanitary standards. These are standards used for any kind of food imports and exports that countries will say, well, this food may have certain chemicals or things like that that we don't agree with. Now, let me clarify. Non-tariff barriers and we're not saying that you should not have regulations when it comes to, let's say, intellectual property, protecting intellectual property. Those exist. It's only when it can be used as a way to limit competition from other countries. That's when it becomes a non-tariff barrier that a company needs to consider when they're talking about different types of regulations. Will this make it more difficult for you to access this market, or is this just a regulation that makes sense,
Ah,
of course, to protect consumers and buyers in that particular market? And that applies to your manufacturers of good, but also for the service providers, because I work with service providers, which gets left out of the conversation as well. Those that provide services, let's say telecommunication services, things, healthcare services, where this is where regulations become even more important because they're not really hit by tariffs. Tariffs are on goods and a tangible product. But for service providers, fortunately, they're not impacted by these tariffs, but you also have regulations of which you need to be aware in order to access these markets, or that may make it more difficult to access these markets.
okay, like what kind of example of a service provider? I'm thinking of like marketing or management consulting companies. They wouldn't have regulations, but like lawyers would? Or is
Yeah.
there?
For the most part, when it comes to many services, they can access these markets, but there may be challenges where, let's say consultants, and I know this working in the consulting space and working on projects overseas, consulting, let's say even legal services, financial services, someone in accounting, there may be an option to provide that service in that market, or telecommunications as well, to provide that service in that market, and there may be discriminatory practices to make it difficult for you to access that market, even if you may be able to provide a quality service, or you may be going up against one big company in that domestic market. They may have a monopoly on that market. So for service providers, the key phrase are discriminatory practices, and that's in many of these trade agreements as well, uh, where different types of rules or just practices, not even necessarily any kind of rules or formal regulations, that just make it difficult for you to access that market because you are not a local service provider.
Wow. Okay. What's the worst story you've seen or heard or worked on with that?
Fortunately, not necessarily when it comes to the regulations, because many of the service providers go the route that I went, is you bid on projects, you work on projects that are funded that gives you that access. What I have
Ah,
seen with it's usually, it's very basic on this one when it comes to service providers. When going back to that, I know someone in this market. They know someone
ah,
in another market, and then they'll travel to the market, don't really have the full knowledge of the landscape, and they'll travel to the market, have all of these conversations, and the worst, and this was when I started my company in 2013, would be, oh, I provide a service and then I don't get paid
ah, okay.
because you're working
Okay.
one-on-one, or if it's not, I don't get paid. It's, I've spent all of this time traveling to, this is where the research comes in beforehand. Why not get this data before you get on a plane or drive across whatever mode of transportation, and then you can be more focused and targeted when you go to that country. But what I've seen is service providers just think, oh, I go to this market, I meet some people, and we have conversation after conversation after conversation. And then when I say, okay, so do we have any deals? Are you providing a service? What's going on? That can be a huge waste of time and money.
Yeah, yeah, huge. All right, so we didn't talk about your background at the beginning, and so it's very impressive. You have a PhD, you've done research, you've done everything to get there, and now you've written a book. Tell me about your book.
Oh, okay. The International Trade and Services, if I could just hold it up right here.
Yeah,
Services.
beautiful.
Yes. So that book, International Trade and Services, was written to fill in the gap with the discussions as well as the training or the opportunities when it comes to international trade. Being a professor, so when I also taught at UCLA Extension. I taught courses on the fundamentals of international trade. And I would see like earlier syllabi, and services was just left out of it. So when I would talk to the students about services and my experience exporting a service, that's how my practical export experience was exporting a service, not moving goods or anything. Um, and looking at different texts, now that there were texts about services trade, but it was highly technical. It wasn't about the practical side of it. It was very technical, lots of theory that I enjoy, but for the average business owner, it's just what do I need to do? What do I need to know so that I can export a service? So that's where this book came from, because I had nothing to, and it was a student that said, hey, do you have any resources on exporting a service? And I said, I really don't. So maybe I can write a book about it. And so that's how that came about. And so it really talks about the impact of services on global trade. When you think about the movement of goods, you can't move goods without services, your logistical services, right? Your transport. And then getting into other types of services, as you mentioned, with the legal services, financial services. And then I also talk about digital trade, which now is with AI, now it's even more of a conversation. But at that time, and this was during the pandemic where I was also observing what was happening, because you would hear, well, trade has slowed down. But I said, well, not necessarily for services, because people are on Zoom or other platforms where I can meet people and provide my service through the use of digital technology. And that is where this book came from, and really providing the details about the role of services trade, and then how do you get involved in exporting a service, what that looks like, and then of course financing. That always comes down to getting capital. How do I get capital so that I can provide my service?
So, Sarita, you're very impressive. You have a PhD from Brown University. You've taught, you've researched, and you've published a book. Tell us about your book.
Great. Okay. Well, yeah. So since we were talking about services, International Trade and Services is the book, Effective Practice and Policy. So this book came out of a need, quite frankly, to fill in a gap when it comes to discussions about international trade, and even some of the programs that I've seen to help businesses that were looking to export or understand how to export. So, for example, I taught classes at UCLA Extension, and it was a course on titled Fundamentals of International Trade. And with this course, I would bring in the discussion about services, because I would see syllabi from other instructors that taught, and even their textbooks just completely ignored trade and services. And I'm coming from the perspective of my practical experience is not shipping goods around the world. It was traveling around the world and providing professional services, consulting services, and working with the team, legal of attorneys, providing legal services, financial services, all of these different types of things. And I noticed that when programs were put on to talk about international trade, most of the people in the room were service providers, but the content was focused on manufacturing. Makes no sense to me. So I had two experiences. One student that asked me, he says, "Oh, you're talking about services. Is there a book about it?" And I thought, no, not quite. That's why I have to share my experience. Even though there are books about international trade and services, they're so highly technical and theory and things of that nature, or talking about the services agreement at the World Trade Organization level, but not necessarily that will help a service provider on how do I access the market? What do I need to know? And then just secondly, there was someone at one of these workshops that came up to me that appreciated the talk about services. And he says, "Yeah, I'm a service provider. I'm sitting 5 weeks in this course, and it's all for manufacturers." And so that's where I said, okay, you know what? I really need to write something that people can use on, first of all, understanding the importance of the services sector in the global economy. Number one, many countries rely on services to grow their economies. It's not manufacturing or agriculture, it's the services sector. And then it's the services sector that allows for the movement of tangible goods. You
Yes,
can't
yes.
move goods, right, if you don't have logistics or transport. So why are we ignoring services? The U.S., when we talk about this trade deficit, well, the trade deficit is lower than it could be. Why? Because we have a surplus in the services sector. We export more than what we import when it comes to services. So this book, My International Trade and Services, fills in that gap by talking about these things, about the importance of the services sector, and then what you need to know as a services provider in terms of accessing markets around the world. And then the key thing that it comes down to is, well, capital. So how do I get access to capital? What are the steps? And a lot of this is based on my own experience, and then also interviewing other service providers that have accessed different markets. How do I access that market using, how do I get access to funds so that I can do that? And then also there's a chapter on digital trade. How do I use digital technology effectively so that I can provide a service where there's a need in different parts of the world?
Yeah, that's, the number one export from the United States is services. And I've had the same experience so many times. They're talking about manufacturers. And, I've mentioned it to a bunch of service providers, and you can see their eyes just light up going, oh, I hadn't thought about that. So where can people find your book?
So my book can be found on Amazon. So you can just look it up and you can purchase it on Amazon, or either go directly to the publisher, Routledge, Taylor and Francis. I don't know if you can, I'll just put it here so you can kind of see it.
So Routledge is
There
Routledge.
Yes.
So Routledge Publishing, and you can look for Sarita Jackson. That's spelled Sarita Jackson, and the name of the book is International Trade in Services. Well, congratulations on your book. I'm thrilled that you wrote that. Well, we're out of time, but I think you're prepared for this. Is that at the end of every episode, I like to ask guests what their favorite foreign word is.
Oh, let's see. I will say my favorite foreign word. Okay, so work with me here, only because not too many people know it, and it's just so unique, right? This gets to understanding culture and language, right? So I will say chin. Chin, like CHIN, like chin, but chin.
Chin.
It's in
What
Spanish.
language is it, and what does it mean?
So it's Spanish, right? However, if you go to Mexico and say, dame un chin, give me un chin, they won't know what you're talking about. It's specific to the Dominican Republic, and it means a little bit. And it means, like, it's a request, like, something as, give me a little bit of this, dame un chin, give me a little bit instead of un poco or un poquito. And the
That's
reason, yeah, I love that word because it captures what I tell people. I'm a fluent Spanish speaker.
uh-huh.
I learned, I grew up in Los Angeles, and for me, it was quite easy. I wanted to learn the language, so it was quite easy being in a city such as Los Angeles to learn the language. But what
Yeah.
I like about it is it shows even within a language, just like with English, right? Even here in the United States, you have different terms in different regions of the United States. And I've lived in different parts of the United States and had to learn different lingos, if you will. It shows the uniqueness of the language in a different culture. And so
Yes.
when I lived in the Dominican Republic, I was on a Fulbright scholarship, and it was just hearing that. So, and some other words, but that's the main one because it slips out when I talk to my friends from, let's say, Mexico or El Salvador, and they're, what are you saying? So, and I like that. And also this is something that I really encourage people to take into account when you're learning language or understand the uniqueness of that culture. And it's amazing how far you can go.
Mhm.
Because when
Yeah.
I go now and I'm at Dame un chin, they just think, oh, you're Dominican.
Yeah.
You're getting not just, how do you say, it's something that there's someone that does Rick Steves Europe, and I liked how he
Yes.
captured traveling when he
Yes.
says, either being a visitor and a tourist versus really getting really understanding and living in a community and understanding how that community actually works. So I don't want to butcher what he said, but I know
Yeah, traveler versus a tourist. A
yeah, there,
tourist gives the service, a traveler goes to understand more. I think I have heard
there
that
we go.
before.
Okay, because I don't want him to
Yes.
listen
Yeah.
and be like, she butchered my
Yeah.
quote. But yeah, that's why, like, different, I know it's a simple word, it's nothing fancy, but it gets that point
Oh.
of really understanding, the uniqueness of the language and of the
Well,
culture.
you are, to me, that's a huge word with huge implications, and exactly why AI is still struggling with language, because if you put that in, it's not going to pick that up for Dominican Spanish because it's a more general Spanish in AI. So
Right.
it's, as the owner of Rapport International, who the podcast is brought to you by, it, that's exactly why we're still in business and AI hasn't taken over the world and made us
Right.
all multilingual. It's words like that, understanding the culture. Yeah, so Sarita, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people reach you if they'd like to learn more or hire you for your services?
Yeah, so they can find me, check out my website, grit.org with two I's, GRIIT.org. And when you go to the website, you can go ahead. If you want to schedule a call with me, you'll see the information pop up. You could go ahead and schedule a call. And, if you need any assistance or just want to share your ideas of where your business is, or if you're considering exporting. And then also, one thing I would like to recommend for someone, if you just want to stay abreast of what's happening, you're not quite ready for any consultation, but you just want to keep abreast of what's going on, my YouTube channel. I have a weekly trade on Tuesdays at 2 where I'm talking about these things such as services, exports, digital trade, what's going on with tariffs. And so you can check that out on my YouTube channel. You can just go to YouTube, and grit, GRIIT, and you will find my YouTube channel.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love that you do that every week. I will have to go back and check some out. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on, Sarita.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I really enjoyed it. I realized I'm passionate about international trade, so I really enjoyed the conversation and hope it's helpful to your viewers.
Yeah, what I got the most out of it is all the trade discussions that have been going on with clients and in the news and advisors and everything. It's like you really brought it down to some actionable steps, and I'm looking forward to reading your book and learning more about that. So congratulations.
Thank you so
Uh,
much.
and listeners, thank you so much for tuning in and talking about books. Definitely go get Sarita's book that is called, oh my goodness. International Trade in Services. It makes complete sense. So go look for that. And speaking of books, my latest book just released 2.5 weeks ago. I co-wrote it with Hannah Feldman Pence 2 weeks ago from when we were recording this. So when you're actually listening to it, it could be any time. But it's called The Secrets of Global Sales: Build, Navigate, and Accelerate Your International Growth. So you can find that on Amazon, or just search for it and it'll go to the website and you can buy it from there. So thank you so much. If you know somebody else who's written a book in global trade or would be an interesting guest for the Global Marketing Show, please refer them over to me. Always looking for good guests, especially good, smart ones like Sarita. So thanks so much, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Global Marketing Show. We started this podcast to capture the stories of people who do global marketing and work for companies that export, since those companies have higher revenues, higher profits, higher valuations, higher salaries, and more stability, according to the U.S. Department of Commerce. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please leave a review and subscribe. And if you know somebody who would be a good guest, introduce them to me, your host, Wendy Mackenzie Pease. If you'd like to learn more about global marketing or language translation and interpretation, visit Rapport International's Resource Center at www.rapporttranslations.com. Au revoir. Hasta luego. Ciao for now.